You're standing on an open plain somewhere in what is now northern Europe. It's 20,000 years ago. There is no grass beneath your feet, just frozen ground stretching in every direction under a sky that's already turning black at 4 in the afternoon. The wind is coming off a wall of ice 2 miles thick, and it doesn't just feel cold. It feels like it wants something from you. This is the last glacial maximum, the coldest point of the most recent ice age, and by every reasonable measure, this environment should have ended us. Most of the large mammals alive at this exact moment in history did not make it through. Mammoths, cave bears, woolly rhinos, entire lineages of megafauna that had survived for millions of years, gone. And somewhere in the middle of all that dying, a small, hairless, slow, weak-clawed primate not only survived, it spread across the entire frozen planet and came out the other side. That should not have happened. And the reason it did is one of the most underrated survival stories our species has ever lived through. Let's start with the scale of the problem, because it's bigger than most people realize. During the last glacial maximum, global temperatures were roughly 6 degrees Celsius colder on average than today. That sounds small? It wasn't. Ice sheets covered nearly a third of Earth's land surface. Sea levels dropped over 100 meters as water locked itself into glaciers, exposing land bridges that let humans walk between continents that are oceans apart today. Entire ecosystems collapsed or migrated south, chasing a habitable climate that kept shrinking. And genetic studies of ancient human DNA reveal something genuinely unsettling. Human population size during this period appears to have crashed dramatically, some estimates suggesting our entire species narrowed down to a surprisingly small number of breeding individuals, spread thin across a handful of survivable pockets on an otherwise hostile planet. We were, at multiple points, closer to extinction than most people ever learn in school. The cold didn't care how clever we were. It just kept coming, season after season, for thousands of years in a row. So how did we make it through something that erased so many other species? The answer starts with fire, but fire alone wasn't enough. Fire had to become infrastructure, something maintained continuously rather than made fresh each time. Because in Ice Age conditions, a fire that went out could mean death within hours, not days. Archaeological sites from this period show hearths reused for generations, embers carried between camps wrapped in slow-burning material, entire social roles built around keeping flame alive around the clock. But fire could only do so much on its own. It could warm a body sitting still. It couldn't protect a body that had to move, hunt, and travel across open, wind-scoured ground. For that, humans needed something else entirely. The real breakthrough wasn't fire. It was the needle. Here's the part almost nobody talks about. Around 40,000 years ago, humans invented something disarmingly small, a bone needle with a tiny-eyed hole for thread. That single object changed everything about how our ancestors related to cold. Before the needle, humans could only drape loose hides over themselves, which meant gaps, drafts, and constant heat loss. After it, they could tailor those hides, sewing multiple layers into fitted garments that trapped body heat with dramatically more efficiency, close at the wrists, sealed at the neck, shaped to the body instead of hung over it. Fitted, layered clothing meant the difference between surviving a Siberian winter on foot, hunting and traveling daily, and freezing solid within it. Some researchers argue the needle did more for human survival during the Ice Age than almost any other single invention in our entire toolkit. Not a weapon, not a fire-starting tool, not even a better spear point. A sewing needle, quietly making the difference between extinction and continuation. Diet shifted just as dramatically. In a landscape where plant food was buried under snow for most of the year, humans turned toward megafauna hunting with focused intensity, and specifically toward fat rather than lean muscle. Lean meat alone can't sustain a human body in extreme cold. Eat too much of it without enough fat, and your body can't generate the internal heat it needs to survive, a phenomenon later explorers would come to fear as literal starvation on a full stomach. You need calorie-dense fat to fuel that internal furnace properly. Mammoth and other large game provided exactly that, hundreds of pounds of fat and marrow from a single kill, enough to sustain a group for weeks at a time. This is why so many Ice Age sites are built directly around megafauna remains, sometimes literally, with mammoth bones used as structural supports for shelters and mammoth hide stretched over the frame as a windproof shell. The animal wasn't just food. It was the building material, the fuel, and the insulation, all harvested from one enormous carcass. None of this worked without cooperation. And this is where the story stops being about individual toughness and starts being about networks. Ice Age survival required social connections that stretched far beyond a single small band camped in one valley. Archaeological evidence shows exchange of tools, ornaments, and raw materials across hundreds of kilometers, connecting groups that may never have met face-to-face but who still relied on each other. This mattered enormously because a single bad season, one failed hunt, one collapsed herd migration could wipe out an isolated group entirely with no one left to notice. Groups linked by trade and kinship had somewhere to turn when their own territory failed them. Isolation, in this environment, was a slow death sentence. Cooperation across long distances was insurance nobody could afford to go without. And then there's the genetic side of the story, which adds a strange final twist to the whole picture. When Homo sapiens moved into these brutally cold environments, we weren't the first ones there. Neanderthals had already been living in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, biologically adapted to the cold in ways our recently arrived species simply wasn't. When the two populations met, and at various points interbred, some of those cold-adapted genes passed directly into the modern human gene pool. Variants linked to immune function, fat metabolism, and skin response that likely helped our ancestors survive conditions their bodies hadn't had time to evolve for on their own. In other words, part of the reason you can trace an unbroken line back through the Ice Age is because your ancestors borrowed survival tools, quite literally written into their DNA, from another species entirely. And yet Neanderthals themselves eventually disappeared, whether through competition for shrinking resources, sudden climate shifts, or sheer bad luck, stacked one disaster too high. The population that had lived in Europe's ice the longest, far longer than we had, didn't make it to the other side. We did. Not because we were tougher, because we were more adaptable, more connected across distance, and more willing to keep inventing our way out of a problem that kept changing shape underneath us. The cold didn't care about any of this. It didn't care about our needles or our fires or our fragile little alliances stretched across frozen plains. It just kept radiating outward the same way it always had, entirely indifferent to which species made it through to spring. But somewhere in that indifference, a small group of humans kept sowing, kept trading, kept feeding a fire that never quite went out, and kept passing down the exact knowledge of how to do all three, generation after generation, with nothing written down anywhere. Next time you put on a coat without thinking twice about it, you're using the direct descendant of a technology invented specifically to keep a species alive through the coldest, most unforgiving chapter it had ever faced. The Ice Age ended thousands of years ago. That thread never did.